The morning sky over Kepler 442b burned red, not the gentle red of sunrise, but the angry crimson of a world dying. Elder Vexhi pressed his six-fingered hand against the observation window and watched his people's greatest city crumble under the weight of the invasion. The Ravagers had come 3 days ago. They fell from space like black rain. Each drop a living ship the size of a building. Now those ships crawled across the surface of his world, eating everything they touched. Trees, grass, buildings, people. It made no difference to them. They consumed it all and grew stronger. Vexhi closed his eyes and tried to remember what his world looked like before. The crystal spires that reached toward the clouds. The singing gardens where his people gathered to share stories. The children who played in pools of warm water that bubbled up from the planet's heart. All of it was gone now, or would be soon. A young Zalani female named Kira ran into the chamber. Her blue skin was pale with fear, and her breathing came in short gasps. She had been running through the underground tunnels for hours, bringing reports from the surface scouts. "Elder," she said, dropping to one knee in the traditional greeting. "The northern cities have fallen. The Ravagers broke through the shield barriers an hour ago. Our defenders. There was nothing left of them." Vexhi nodded slowly. He had expected this news, but hearing it still felt like a blade through his heart. The northern cities housed nearly 2 million of his people. Now they were gone, absorbed into the growing mass of the Ravager swarm. "How long do we have?" he asked. Kira looked at the floor. "The military council believes the outer defenses will hold for another day. Maybe 2 if we are lucky. 2 days. 50 million Zalani lived in the underground cities beneath the capital. In 2 days they would all be dead, and Kepler 442b would be just another empty world stripped bare by the Ravager swarm." Vexhi walked to the center of the chamber where an ancient device waited. The quantum beacon had been built by his ancestors 1,000 years ago, when the Zalani first reached for the stars. It was meant to call out across the galaxy, to find other thinking beings among the endless night. His people had used it only once before when they made first contact with the ethereal collective. "Elder," Kira said quietly, "surely one of the great powers will help us. The ethereals have ships that can cross the galaxy in days. The Cronin Empire has weapons that can crack planets. The Alterian Council has always spoken of protecting the innocent." Vexhi touched the smooth surface of the beacon. It was warm under his hand, humming with power that came from the planet's core itself. "Perhaps," he said, "but they are far away and we are running out of time." He activated the beacon with a touch of his mind. The device had been grown rather than built, shaped by Zalani biotechnology into something that was half machine and half living thing. It responded to his thoughts, reaching out with invisible fingers of quantum energy that could touch any part of the galaxy. The message he crafted was simple. Complex words and diplomatic language would take too long to send and longer to understand. Instead, he poured his heart into the signal, letting his desperation and love for his people color every word. "This is Elder Vexhi of the Zalani people on the world you call Kepler 442b. We are dying. The Ravagers came from the void and now they consume our world. Our defenses have failed. Our weapons cannot stop them. We have perhaps 2 days before the last of us falls to their hunger. Someone, anyone, please help us. We do not want to die forgotten in the dark." The beacon sent the message racing across space faster than light itself, carried by quantum waves that could reach any world with the right equipment to receive them. Vexhi slumped against the device, exhausted by the effort. Now all they could do was wait and hope. Light years away, the message reached the crystal cities of the ethereal collective. These beings of pure thought lived in towers that floated above their homeworld, sustained by technology so advanced it seemed like magic. They received Vexhi's plea and began to debate. The discussion lasted for 3 full days. The ethereals considered every angle, every possibility. They calculated the distance to Kepler 442b, the time it would take to mount a rescue mission, the resources it would require. They debated the military strength of the Ravager swarm and the likelihood of success. In the end, they decided the risk was too great. The Zalani were a young species with little to offer the galaxy. The Ravagers were a known threat that had consumed a dozen of worlds. Better to let this one pass and focus on defending more important systems. The Cronin Empire received the message as well. These warrior beings lived for battle, their entire culture built around conquest and strength. They had the ships and weapons needed to fight the Ravagers, but they also had their own problems. A border war with the Thessian Republic was draining their fleets, and the Emperor needed every ship to defend Cronin space. The military council met for exactly 1 hour. They ran the numbers through their tactical computers and reached a conclusion based purely on logic. The Zilani offered nothing of strategic value. Kepler 442b had no rare minerals or useful technology. Saving them would cost ships and lives that could be better spent elsewhere. The Alterian Council was the last great power to receive the message. These ancient beings prided themselves on wisdom and compassion. They had guided younger species for thousands of years, sharing knowledge and helping to maintain peace in their corner of the galaxy. They agonized over the decision for a full week. Emergency sessions were called. Philosophers and ethicists debated the moral implications. Military advisors explained the tactical impossibilities. The Ravagers were simply too strong, the distance too great, the time too short. With heavy hearts, they chose to do nothing. It was a practical decision, they told themselves. Sometimes the greater good required difficult choices. They would remember the Zilani in their prayers and learn from this tragedy. But the message traveled farther than the great powers of known space. It reached the edges of the galaxy where smaller, younger civilizations struggled to survive. Most of these species lacked the technology or military strength to mount a rescue mission. They could only listen to the dying plea and feel helpless. On a small blue world orbiting an unremarkable yellow star, the message was received by Deep Space Monitor Station Omega-7. Communications Officer Jake Morrison was pulling the night shift when his equipment started picking up the strange signal. Jake was young for his position, only 26 years old, but he had a gift for languages and code breaking that had earned him his post. He worked through the night to decode the quantum message, his coffee growing cold as he unraveled the alien words. When he finally understood what he was reading, Jake sat back in his chair and stared at the screen. Somewhere in the dark between the stars, an entire species was about to die. They had called out for help and nobody was coming. Jake picked up his communication headset and opened a channel to his commanding officer. Commander Lisa Banks answered on the second ring, her voice sharp with the authority that had made her the youngest commander in the Earth Defense Network. "This better be important, Morrison," she said. "It's 3 a.m. "Commander," Jake said, his voice steady despite the weight of what he was about to say. "I need you to come down here. I've got something you need to see." 20 minutes later, Lisa Banks stood behind Jake's console reading the translated message. She was a small woman with dark hair and eyes that missed nothing. She had fought in the Titan War and commanded ships in the asteroid belt conflicts. She knew what death looked like, and she could hear it in every word of the alien plea. "How long ago was this sent?" she asked. "The quantum signature suggests about 18 hours, Jake replied. "But given the distance, they might already be gone." Lisa was quiet for a long moment, reading the message again. Then she reached for her personal communicator and opened a priority channel to Earth Defense Command. "This is Commander Banks at Omega-7, she said when the connection went through. "I need to speak with Admiral Stevens immediately. Tell him it's about a first contact situation and tell him it can't wait." Admiral Carl Stevens was drinking his morning coffee when the call came through. He was a big man with gray hair and scars on his hands from his days as a ship engineer. He had worked his way up from the lowest ranks to command the entire Earth Defense Network, and he had never forgotten what it felt like to be powerless. He listened to Lisa Banks explain the situation, asking questions when he needed clarification. When she finished, he was quiet for several minutes, thinking through the implications. "Commander," he finally said, "prepare a full briefing packet. I'm calling an emergency session of the Defense Council. If these Zilani are still alive when we get there, we're bringing them home." Lisa felt something tight in her chest ease for the first time since reading the message. "Sir, with respect, the other powers have already decided it's impossible. We don't have their technology or firepower." "Maybe not," Stevens replied, "but we've got something they don't." "What's that, sir?" The Admiral smiled, and there was something in his expression that would have made the Ravager swarm think twice about coming to Earth. "We've got a bad habit of doing impossible things when somebody needs help." The human fleet dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Kepler system, 2 weeks after receiving the Zilani distress call. Captain Nick Parker stood on the bridge of the battlecruiser UES Valkyrie and stared at the tactical display with growing horror. What should have been a beautiful blue-green world was now half black, its surface crawling with movement that looked like a disease spreading across healthy skin. "My God," whispered Lieutenant Bobby Chen from the navigation station. "Are we too late?" Parker studied the readings flowing across his screens. The planet was still there, but huge sections of it looked wrong. Where there should have been cities and forests, the sensors showed only writhing masses of organic material that pulsed with alien life. Communications, Parker called to his officer. Try to raise the planet. Any frequency, any signal. Let them know we're here. Ensign Kelly Wright worked at her station, cycling through every known communication method. For long minutes, there was nothing but static. Then, cutting through the interference, came a voice speaking in accented but understandable English. Unknown vessels. This is Elder Vexhai of the Zelani people. Please identify yourselves before the Ravagers detect your presence. Parker felt a surge of relief. Someone was still alive down there. Elder Vexhai, this is Captain Nick Parker of the United Earthship Valkyrie. We received your distress call. We're here to help. The silence that followed lasted so long that Parker wondered if they had lost the connection. When Vexhai finally spoke again, his voice was filled with disbelief. You came, but the great powers, they said it was impossible. The distance, the danger, the cost. We're not the great powers, Parker replied. We're humans, and we don't abandon people who need help. On the planet's surface, deep in the underground city of New Harmony, Elder Vexhai stared at his communication equipment with tears in his large black eyes. Around him, other Zelani had gathered to listen to the conversation. They had given up hope days ago when the last surface city fell to the Ravagers. Now impossibly someone had come for them. Captain Parker, Vexhai said, his voice steadying with newfound hope. You must understand what you face here. The Ravagers are not like any enemy your species has encountered. They learn from every attack, adapting their defenses to counter whatever weapons are used against them. 3 other species have tried to stop them. All failed. Tell me about these other attempts, Parker said, settling into his command chair. Around him, his crew worked to analyze the tactical situation. The Ethereal Collective sent a battle group 2 years ago, when the Ravagers first appeared. Their energy weapons worked well at first, destroying dozens of the bioships. But within hours, the Ravagers had adapted, growing new armor that absorbed the energy blasts. The ethereal ships were overwhelmed. Parker nodded, making notes on his personal tablet. What about the others? The Cronin Empire tried next. They used projectile weapons and explosives, thinking that physical force would be harder to adapt to. Again, they had initial success, but the Ravagers developed reactive armor and began secreting acids that dissolved incoming shells before they could detonate. The Cronin fleet barely escaped. And the third attempt? The Thessian Republic brought bioweapons, thinking they could use the Ravagers' own nature against them. The organic viruses and toxins worked for perhaps an hour before the swarm developed immunity. The Thessian ships were absorbed. Their crews became part of the Ravager Collective. Parker exchanged glances with Commander Lisa Banks, who had been listening from her position at the tactical station. She had transferred to his ship to coordinate the fleet's strategy, and he could see her mind already working on the problem. Elder, Lisa said, stepping forward. How quickly do they adapt? Are we talking minutes, hours, days? Minutes for simple adaptations, hours for complex ones. The more advanced the technology, the faster they seem to learn. It's as if they can analyze and counter sophisticated systems more easily than primitive ones. Lisa smiled, and there was something predatory in her expression that made several of her own crew members take a step back. Captain, she said to Parker, I think I have an idea. But first we need to see what we're dealing with. The human fleet moved deeper into the system, their sensors taking detailed readings of the Ravager swarm. What they found challenged everything they thought they knew about space combat. The Ravagers didn't build ships in the traditional sense. Instead, they grew them from organic matter, harvested from consumed worlds. Each bioship was a living creature, capable of healing damage, evolving new capabilities, and reproducing by splitting into smaller vessels. Captain Maya Rodriguez, commanding the assault carrier UES Thunderhawk, studied the tactical data with growing amazement. These things aren't following any rules we understand. Look at this. That bioship just split into 3 smaller ones, and now they're all heading for different targets. Captain Sam Collins, whose support vessel UES Guardian was loaded with marines and supplies, watched his sensors track dozens of the alien ships. How do you fight something that changes every time you look at it? You don't, Lisa Banks said over the fleet communication channel. You make it fight you on your terms instead. She called up a tactical display that showed the 3 human ships surrounded by hundreds of Ravager biovessels. To any sane military mind, it looked like suicide, but Lisa had never been accused of being entirely sane. Here's what we know, she continued. These things adapt quickly to advanced technology, but they've been fighting high-tech enemies for 2 years. Their entire defensive strategy is built around countering energy weapons, guided missiles, and sophisticated electronic warfare. So what do you suggest? Parker asked. We go primitive. We show them something they've never seen before and can't prepare for. Lisa's plan was so simple that it bordered on insanity. The first wave of the assault would consist of Marines in basic atmospheric suits, armed with weapons that wouldn't have looked out of place in Earth's medieval period. Explosive-tipped spears, chemical flamethrowers, and projectile weapons that fired simple metal slugs. Colonel Danny White, the grizzled Marine commander, who had volunteered to lead the ground assault, listened to the briefing with growing disbelief. Let me see if I understand this correctly, he said, his scarred face serious. You want me to take my Marines down to that nightmare planet armed with pointy sticks and fire throwers? That's exactly what I want, Lisa replied. The Ravagers have adaptive defenses designed to counter plasma rifles and particle beams. But I'll bet they've never faced a human with a sharp piece of metal and an attitude problem. Danny was quiet for a moment, then started to grin. It was not a pleasant expression. Ma'am, I've been a Marine for 22 years, and I've fought everything from asteroid pirates to rogue AI. But I've never been in a fight where being primitive was an advantage. There's a first time for everything, Colonel. Yes, ma'am. How many volunteers do you need? All of them, Lisa said simply. The word spread through the fleet like wildfire. Marines, engineers, even some of the ship's crew volunteered for what everyone knew was a suicide mission. They stripped their equipment down to basics, discarding advanced weapons and armor in favor of simple, reliable tools. Sergeant Kelly Murphy, a small woman with arms covered in tattoos, looked at her assigned weapon and started laughing. She had been given a modified construction tool that fired metal spikes powered by compressed air. It looked like something a barbarian might use, and she loved it. Hey, Sarge, called out Private Joe Henderson, hefting his own primitive weapon. Think this thing will actually work? Henderson, Kelly replied, checking the edge on her combat knife. If it doesn't work, we'll beat them to death with our bare hands. That's what humans do. Down on the planet's surface, the Ravagers detected the approaching human fleet and began to prepare their defenses. Bioships positioned themselves in orbital patterns, their adaptive armor already shifting to counter expected energy weapons. Defensive organisms spread across the planet's surface, ready to neutralize incoming missiles and projectiles. They had faced many enemies over the years, and they had defeated them all using the same basic strategy. Analyze the enemy's technology, adapt their defenses accordingly, then overwhelm them with superior numbers. It had never failed. But as the first wave of human landing craft approached the planet's atmosphere, the Ravager Collective encountered something they had never experienced before: complete tactical confusion. The human shuttles were crude, barely armored vessels that used chemical rockets for propulsion. Their weapons were simple kinetic devices that fired metal projectiles at relatively low velocities. By every measure the Ravagers understood, these should have been the easiest enemies they had ever faced. So why did their entire collective intelligence feel something it had never experienced before? Fear. The first human boots touched Zilani soil 12 hours after the fleet's arrival. Colonel Danny White stepped out of his landing craft onto a landscape that looked like something from hell itself. The ground was covered in a thick, writhing carpet of Ravager biomatter that pulsed and moved like living skin. Well, he said to his Marines as Ravager warrior forms began emerging from the organic mass, this is definitely going to be interesting. The first Ravager warrior form that charged at Colonel Danny White looked like a nightmare made real. It stood 8 feet tall on 6 legs that ended in razor-sharp claws. Its body was covered in bioarmor that shifted and changed color as it moved, and acid dripped from fangs the size of kitchen knives. Danny hefted his explosive-tipped spear and waited until the creature was 10 feet away before hurling it with all his strength. The metal point punched through the alien's chest armor and detonated, sending chunks of biomatter flying in all directions. The Ravager Collective paused for a moment, trying to process what had just happened. Their warrior forms were designed to absorb energy blasts and deflect high-velocity projectiles. But this simple metal spear had punched right through defenses that had stopped Cronin battle cannons. More warrior forms poured out of the writhing ground mass, their bodies already adapting to counter the spear attack. Thicker armor began to grow across their chests, and their movements became more erratic to avoid thrown weapons. That was when Sergeant Kelly Murphy opened fire with her compressed air spike gun. The metal spikes flew in a tight grouping, punching through 3 Ravager warriors before they could react. But instead of reloading, Kelly dropped the weapon and pulled out her combat knife. "Out of ammo already, Sarge?" called Private Joe Henderson as he smashed a warrior form with a club made from salvaged metal. "Don't need ammo for this," Kelly replied, and she leaped onto the back of a charging Ravager. What happened next made even the hardened Marines stop and stare. Kelly drove her knife into the creature's neck joint, twisted it to sever something important, then used the spurting biofluid to blind 2 more warriors before they could attack her. The Ravager Collective had never encountered anything like this. Their warrior forms were designed to fight at range, using acid spray and energy discharge to kill enemies before they could get close. Close combat was supposed to be impossible against their armored hides and toxic blood. But these humans seemed to prefer fighting at arm's length, and they didn't seem to care that Ravager blood could melt metal. Lieutenant Tony Garcia had landed his squad near what used to be the Zalani capital city. Now it was a twisted maze of organic structures that pulsed with alien life. Somewhere in the distance he could see one of the massive Ravager bioships that served as mobile command centers. "Squad leaders, listen up," he said into his radio. "We're going to try something that's either brilliant or completely insane." "What's the plan, sir?" asked Corporal Amy Foster, who was busy sharpening her combat knife on a piece of broken concrete. "We're going to board that bioship." His squad stared at him. Boarding actions were difficult enough against normal spacecraft. Trying to board a living ship that could defend itself seemed like suicide. "Sir," said Private Chuck Williams carefully, "that thing is the size of a city block. It probably has defensive systems we can't even imagine." "Exactly," Tony replied with a grin. "They'll be expecting us to attack it from the outside with heavy weapons. They won't be ready for us to cut our way in through the bottom and work our way up." The plan was so crazy that it actually made sense. While the bioship's defensive systems focused on threats from space, Tony's squad used improvised cutting tools to slice through the vessel's hull near where it touched the ground. The inside of a Ravager bioship was like being inside a living creature. The walls pulsed with circulation systems that carried nutrients and information throughout the vessel. Defensive organisms the size of house cats scuttled through corridors that grew and shifted as the ship tried to heal the damage the humans were causing. Tony led his squad deeper into the ship, following his compass toward what he hoped was the command center. When defensive organisms attacked, his Marines fought them off with nothing but knives and determination. "This is disgusting," muttered Private Sarah Lee as she stomped on something that looked like a cross between a spider and a jellyfish. "Yeah, but it's working," Tony replied, kicking open a sphincter-like doorway that tried to close in his face. They reached the ship's central chamber to find something that defied description. The command center was a massive organic brain, pulsing with thought patterns that controlled the entire vessel. Tubes and nerve bundles connected it to every part of the ship, and it was protected by a thick membrane that looked impenetrable. "How do we kill something like that?" asked Corporal Foster. Tony pulled out the improvised explosive device he had been saving for a special occasion. It was nothing more than chemical explosives packed into a metal tube, with a timer made from spare parts. "Same way we kill everything else," he said, setting the timer for 30 seconds. "We blow it up." The explosion tore through the bioship's command center like a thunderbolt. Without its controlling brain, the massive vessel began to convulse and die, its defensive systems shutting down one by one. On the planet's surface, other human squads were discovering their own ways to fight the seemingly unstoppable enemy. Staff Sergeant Chris Bell had run out of ammunition for his projectile weapon after the first hour of fighting. Instead of retreating, he began making new weapons from the battlefield itself. Ravager bioarmor made excellent clubs when torn off dead warrior forms. Alien acid sacs could be thrown like grenades. Even the strange metal that the Zalani used in their buildings could be sharpened into effective spears. "Bell, what the hell are you doing?" called Captain Rodriguez from the Thunderhawk as she watched his squad through her surveillance drones. "Learning, ma'am," Chris replied as he used a piece of Ravager carapace to deflect acid spray from an attacking warrior form. These bugs adapt to our weapons, but they can't adapt to their own body parts being used against them. The Ravager Collective was becoming increasingly confused. Every time they developed a defense against human weapons, the humans simply switched to something else. When they adapted to projectile weapons, the humans used bladed weapons. When they countered those, the humans started using Ravager biology as weapons. Most disturbing of all, the humans seemed to be enjoying themselves. Corporal Amy Foster had discovered that Ravager warrior forms had excellent handholds if you knew where to grab them. She spent the afternoon climbing on the backs of the alien creatures, driving her knife into their nerve clusters and riding them until they collapsed. "Foster," shouted her squad leader. "What are you doing?" "Breaking horses, Sarge," she called back as she leaped from one dying Ravager to another. "Just like back home in Texas." The psychological effect on the Ravager Collective was devastating. They had conquered dozens of worlds by overwhelming their enemies with superior numbers and adaptation. But these humans didn't seem to understand that they were supposed to be afraid. Private Joe Henderson had earned a reputation among both species when he ran out of explosives during an attack on a Ravager breeding pit. Instead of retreating, he grabbed one of the alien larvae and began using it as a club to beat the adult warrior forms. "Henderson, you magnificent lunatic," laughed Colonel White as he watched the young Marine single-handedly clear a nest of enemies, using nothing but their own offspring as weapons. "Colonel," Joe replied between swings, "my daddy always said that if you're going to fight dirty, you might as well fight dirtier than the other guy." But the true breakthrough came when Chief Petty Officer Bill Wright made a discovery that changed everything. He had been analyzing Ravager movement patterns when he noticed something strange. The warrior forms were avoiding areas where human scent was strongest. "Captain Parker," he reported over the communication channel, "I think these things are actually afraid of us." "Explain that, Chief." "Well, sir, the Ravager swarm has been consuming worlds for years. But look at their behavior patterns. When we first landed, they charged straight at us. Now they're using hit-and-run tactics, trying to avoid direct contact. That's not adaptation, sir. That's fear." Parker studied the tactical displays from his command chair. Wright was right. The Ravager attacks had become less coordinated, more desperate. They were still dangerous, but they were no longer the unstoppable force that had terrified the galaxy. "How is that possible?" asked Commander Banks. "These things have eaten entire civilizations." "Because those civilizations fought them like civilized beings," Wright replied. "They used proper tactics, advanced weapons, logical strategies. But we're not fighting like a civilized species, ma'am. We're fighting like predators." On the planet's surface, Lieutenant Commander Rachel Stone was coordinating her troops using hand signals and bird calls that the technologically dependent Ravagers couldn't decode. Her Marines moved through the alien landscape like a pack of hunting animals, striking without warning and disappearing before the enemy could respond. "Stone Actual. This is Valkyrie," came Captain Parker's voice over her headset. "What's your status?" "We've cleared 3 breeding pits and a bioship manufacturing center," Rachel reported as she watched her scouts return from their latest raid. "The enemy is retreating from this sector." "Retreating? Are you sure?" "Positive, sir. They're actually running away from us." Captain Maya Rodriguez, monitoring the situation from orbit, watched in amazement as Ravager bioships began pulling back from areas where human forces were operating. For the first time in their recorded history, the swarm was retreating from a prey species. The Ravager collective intelligence experienced something it had never felt before in its long existence across the stars. For the first time since it began consuming worlds, it was truly afraid. These humans were not like the other species it had fought. The Ethereals had attacked with elegant energy weapons and precise tactics. The Cronins had used overwhelming firepower and military discipline. The Thessians had employed biological warfare with scientific precision. But these creatures from the small blue world fought like nothing in the galaxy's recorded history. They used their enemies' own bodies as weapons. They laughed while covered in alien blood. They charged into hopeless situations and somehow survived through sheer determination and creativity. Worst of all, they were unpredictable. The collective tried to understand the pattern of human behavior. When faced with superior numbers, they split into smaller groups. When their weapons failed, they made new ones from whatever was available. When cornered, they became more dangerous instead of surrendering. It made no logical sense. Deep in the underground city of New Harmony, Elder Vexhai monitored the surface battle through the few remaining sensor networks. What he saw challenged everything he thought he knew about warfare. The humans had been outnumbered 1,000 to 1 when they landed, but somehow they were winning. "Elder," said Kira, the young female who had brought him the news of the northern city's fall. "The humans have cleared the entire western continent. The Ravagers are retreating to their primary hive structures." Vexhai studied the tactical display with growing amazement. In 3 days, these strange beings had accomplished what 3 advanced civilizations had failed to do in years of fighting. They had made the Ravagers afraid. "How many humans did they lose?" he asked. Kira consulted her readings. "Their casualty reports indicate they have lost perhaps 100 of their warriors." 100? Vexhai could barely believe it. The Cronin Empire lost 50,000 troops in their failed attempt. The Ethereals sacrificed entire battle fleets. "How is this possible?" Before Kira could answer, a new voice came through their communication system. It was Captain Parker from the human fleet. "Elder Vexhai, this is Captain Parker. We need to discuss the final phase of the operation." "Captain," Vexhai replied, "your people have already done the impossible. Perhaps it would be wise to evacuate while you still can. The Ravagers are gathering their remaining forces for what appears to be a massive counterattack." "That's exactly what we're counting on," Parker said, and there was something in his voice that made Vexhai shiver. "We want them to throw everything they have at us." On the surface, Colonel Danny White was studying intelligence reports from his scouts. The Ravagers had pulled back to their central hive complex, a massive organic structure that covered nearly 50 square miles. It was their command center, breeding facility, and final stronghold all in one. "Sir," reported Sergeant Kelly Murphy, who had somehow acquired a necklace made from Ravager claws during the fighting. "The scouts estimate there are at least 10,000 warrior forms in that hive, plus whatever defensive systems they've grown." Danny nodded, cleaning the blade of his combat knife with a piece of alien biomatter. "What about those big bioships?" 3 of them left in orbit, sir. Each one is the size of a city. If they decide to provide ground support, they won't," Danny said with certainty. "These things are scared now. They're thinking about survival instead of victory. That makes them predictable." Staff Sergeant Chris Bell approached, carrying an armload of weapons he had improvised from battlefield salvage. "Colonel, I've been thinking about our ammunition problem." "What ammunition problem?" Danny asked. "We're almost out of everything, sir. Explosives, projectiles, even those metal spikes for the air guns. If we're going to assault that hive, we'll be going in with nothing but knives and clubs." Danny smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "Bell, that's not a problem. That's an opportunity." The plan that emerged from the human command staff was so audacious that even hardened Marines started to question their officers' sanity. They were going to assault the Ravager hive complex using nothing but hand weapons and improvised tools. Lieutenant Tony Garcia, fresh from his successful bioship boarding operation, was given command of the main assault force. "Sir," he said to Colonel White, "with respect, this sounds like suicide." "Garcia," Danny replied, "everything we've done since we landed has sounded like suicide. But we're still here and the bugs are running scared. Trust me on this one." Captain Maya Rodriguez watched the preparations from her position aboard the Thunderhawk. Her assault shuttles were being loaded with Marines carrying weapons that looked like they belonged in a museum. Sharpened metal bars, improvised clubs, chemical fire throwers that worked on the same principle as ancient flame weapons. "Rodriguez to all units," she announced over the fleet communication channel. "In case anyone is wondering, yes, we are about to assault an alien fortress using medieval weapons. And yes, it's going to work." The first wave of the assault began at dawn. 200 human Marines advanced across the twisted landscape toward the Ravager hive, their primitive weapons gleaming in the alien sunlight. They moved in small groups, using the terrain for cover and communicating with hand signals. The Ravagers detected them coming and prepared their defenses. Acid-spitting organisms emerged from hidden chambers. Warrior forms took positions along the hive's organic walls. Biocannons that fired explosive projectiles swiveled to track the approaching humans. But something was wrong. The humans weren't behaving like any attacking force the Ravagers had ever seen. Instead of charging directly at the defenses, they seemed to be playing some kind of game. Corporal Amy Foster had discovered that Ravager acid spitters had a limited range and a slow reload time. She danced between their shots, getting closer with each dodge, until she was close enough to drive her knife into their central nerve cluster. "Foster, you're showing off," called Lieutenant Garcia over the radio. "Sir, if you're not having fun, you're doing it wrong," she replied, using a dead acid spitter as a shield while she advanced toward the next defensive position. Private Joe Henderson had found a new use for the improvised explosive devices that the engineers had cobbled together from spare parts. Instead of throwing them like grenades, he was using them to collapse sections of the hive wall, creating new entry points that the Ravagers hadn't anticipated. "Henderson!" shouted Sergeant Murphy. "Stop blowing holes in things unless you know what's on the other side." "But Sarge," Joe called back as debris from his latest explosion rained down around him. "That's half the fun." The psychological effect on the Ravager collective was devastating. They had prepared for a conventional assault using standard military tactics. Instead, they were facing what appeared to be a group of insane predators who treated warfare like a sport. Chief Petty Officer Bill Wright had set up an observation post on a hill overlooking the battle. What he saw confirmed his theory about Ravager behavior patterns. The aliens were no longer fighting to win. They were fighting to survive. "All units, this is Wright," he reported over the tactical channel. "The enemy is showing clear signs of panic. Their formations are breaking down, and individual warrior forms are starting to flee instead of following collective orders." Captain Parker received the report on his command bridge with grim satisfaction. "Wright, what's your assessment of their overall combat effectiveness?" "Sir, they've gone from apex predator to frightened prey in less than a week. I don't think they've ever encountered a species that fights back harder when outnumbered." Down in the hive complex, Lieutenant Tony Garcia and his assault team had penetrated to the central breeding chambers. What they found there would haunt their dreams for years to come, but it also filled them with righteous anger. The chambers were filled with the remains of consumed civilizations. Cronin battle armor hung from organic hooks like trophies. Ethereal crystal technology had been absorbed into the hive structure. Most disturbing of all were the organic pods that contained the partially digested remains of sentient beings from dozens of species. "My God," whispered Private Chuck Williams. "How many people did they kill?" "All of them," Tony replied, his voice hard with controlled rage. "Every species they've ever encountered. But it ends here." The final assault on the hive's control center began with a sound that chilled the Ravager collective to its core. It was the sound of human voices raised in something that was part war cry, part song, and part promise of vengeance. Staff Sergeant Chris Bell led the charge with a weapon he had crafted from Ravager bioarmor and Zilani metal. Behind him came Marines carrying clubs made from alien bones, spears tipped with acid sacs, and flamethrowers that burned with the fury of a species that had seen too much suffering. The Ravagers tried to mount a final defense, but their coordination had collapsed. Individual warrior forms fought desperately, but without the collective intelligence to guide them. They were just animals facing human predators. All units, came Colonel White's voice over the radio. "The hive's central control structure is down. Repeat, the brain is dead." Across the planet's surface, Ravager bioships began to convulse and die as their controlling intelligence fragmented. Captain Sam Collins stood on the bridge of the UES Guardian as his ship raced toward the 3 descending Ravager capital ships. Each alien vessel was the size of a city, their bio-hulls pulsing with weapons that could crack planets. His own ship was a support vessel, built for carrying supplies and troops, not for fighting monsters. "Captain," said his communications officer, Lieutenant Brad Murphy, "the other ships are requesting our status." Sam looked out at the stars one last time, thinking about his wife back on Earth and the children he would never see grow up. Then he opened the fleet channel and spoke in a voice that was steady and calm. "Valkyrie Thunderhawk, this is Guardian Actual. Tell Admiral Stevens that we kept our promise. Tell the Zilani that Earth's beasts don't abandon their friends, and tell my crew's families that they died as heroes." He switched to the ship's internal communication system. "All hands, this is the captain. We are about to ram the enemy capital ships. All crew to escape pods immediately." That's an order. But when Sam reached the escape pod bay 10 minutes later, he found it empty. His entire crew was at their stations preparing for the final assault. "Captain," said Chief Engineer Lisa Torres, With respect, sir, we're not going anywhere. Torres, I gave you an order. Yes, sir, and we heard it, but we also heard what those things did to the people they captured. We've seen what they left behind in that hive. If someone needs to stop them, then we all stop them together. Sam felt his throat tighten with emotion. These people had volunteered for what they knew was a suicide mission, and now they were volunteering to die with him rather than let him face the enemy alone. All right, he said quietly. Then let's make this count. The Guardian accelerated to ramming speed, her engines glowing white-hot as they pushed beyond all safety limits. In her cargo holds, every explosive device the humans had brought was wired together into one massive bomb. If they could get close enough to detonate it inside the enemy formation, the blast would destroy all 3 capital ships. The Ravager vessels detected the approaching human ship and began firing. Biocannons that fired acid projectiles the size of buildings lit up the darkness. Energy beams that could melt asteroids reached out to swat the tiny Guardian from space. But Sam Collins had learned something about flying from 20 years in the Earth Defense Network. Sometimes the best way to avoid getting hit was to do something so crazy that the enemy couldn't predict it. The Guardian corkscrewed through the weapon fire, rolling and diving in patterns that defied every rule of space combat. When a biocannon locked onto their position, Sam would flip the ship upside down and accelerate in the opposite direction. When energy beams tried to track them, he would shut down the engines and drift like a dead hulk until the weapons moved on to other targets. 30 seconds to impact, called out Navigator Pete Jackson from his station. All hands, brace for collision, Sam announced. Then on the fleet channel he added, Parker Rodriguez, it's been an honor serving with you. Give them hell. The Guardian struck the lead Ravager capital ship at a significant fraction of light speed. The collision tore through the biohull like paper, carrying the human ship deep into the alien vessel's core before the massive explosive charge detonated. The explosion lit up the night sky of Kepler 442b like a second sun. When the light faded, all 3 Ravager capital ships were gone, reduced to debris that rained down on the planet's surface like metallic snow. On the ground, Colonel Danny White watched the fireworks display overhead and felt something tight in his chest. Good people had died today, but their sacrifice had broken the back of the Ravager swarm once and for all. All units, this is White, he announced over the tactical channel. The capital ships are down. Begin mop-up operations on remaining ground forces. But there was no mop-up operation needed. With their capital ships destroyed and their hive mind shattered, the remaining Ravager warrior forms had lost all coordination. Some wandered aimlessly across the battlefield. Others simply collapsed and died, their biological systems failing, without the collective intelligence to sustain them. The few that retained any sense of purpose were fleeing the planet as fast as their bioships could carry them. For the first time in their recorded history, the Ravager swarm was in full retreat. Deep in the underground city of New Harmony, Elder Vex High received reports that seemed impossible to believe. The surface sensors showed that the Ravager biomass was dying. Plants were beginning to grow again in areas where the alien organisms had been destroyed. The sky was clearing as atmospheric processors that had been consumed and corrupted began to function normally again. Elder, said Kira, her voice filled with wonder. The humans have done it. They've actually saved our world. Vex High was quiet for a long moment, trying to understand what had just happened. 3 great civilizations had failed to stop the Ravagers, but these strange beings from a small world at the edge of known space had succeeded where everyone else had failed. Send a message to Captain Parker, he said finally. Tell him that the Zalani people are forever in humanity's debt. But Captain Parker had other concerns. His fleet medical officer was reporting casualties from the ground operation. 43 Marines had been killed in the fighting, with another 100 wounded. By any measure, it was a light casualty count for an operation of this scale, but every loss weighed heavily on his conscience. Captain, said Commander Lisa Banks, we need to discuss the evacuation of the Zalani population. This world will take years to recover from the Ravager infestation. Parker nodded. The planet was saved, but it would be decades before it could support a large population again. The surviving Zalani would need to be relocated to a new homeworld. How many people are we talking about? He asked. Approximately 47 million survivors in the underground cities, Banks replied. We can fit maybe 10,000 on our 3 ships. We'll need to call for additional transport. But before Parker could respond, His communications officer intercepted a signal that changed everything. It was a message from the Ethereal Collective, broadcast on all known frequencies. This is High Counselor Zephron of the Ethereal Collective, addressing the human vessels in the Kepler system. We have monitored your engagement with the Ravager swarm. We offer our assistance in evacuating the Zilani survivors and wish to discuss other matters. Within hours, the Kepler system was filled with ships from a dozen different species. The Ethereal Collective sent crystal transports that could carry millions of people in comfort. The Cronin Empire dispatched engineering vessels to help repair the planet's damaged ecosystem. Even the normally isolationist Alterian Council sent medical ships to treat the wounded. But they weren't coming just to help the Zilani. They were coming to meet the species that had accomplished the impossible. Admiral Carl Stevens arrived from Earth aboard the battleship UES Defiance, accompanied by a fleet of diplomats and scientists. As his ship entered orbit around Kepler 442b, he was greeted by a sight that would have been unimaginable a month earlier. Representatives from every major civilization in the galaxy were waiting to speak with humanity. The same species that had ignored the Zilani distress call were now eager to establish diplomatic relations with the people who had answered. "It, Admiral," said Captain Parker as Stevens toured the battlefield where Colonel White's Marines had broken the Ravager ground forces. "I think we've gotten their attention." "That we have, Nick," Stevens replied, watching as ethereal crystal ships worked alongside Cronin heavy lifters to evacuate Zilani civilians. "The question is, what do we do with it?" The answer came during the memorial service for the humans who had died in the operation. Elder Vexhai spoke for his people, but his words were broadcast across the galaxy. "We called for salvation," he said, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd of humans and aliens alike. "And the universe sent us its monsters. But these monsters chose to be our guardians instead of our destroyers. Today we learned that the most dangerous predator in the galaxy is one that chooses to protect rather than consume." As the service concluded, Communications Officer Jake Morrison approached Admiral Stevens with a datapad filled with new signals. "Sir," he said, "we're receiving distress calls from 17 different systems. Species that have never heard of Earth before are specifically requesting human assistance." Stevens looked at the list of requests. Pirate attacks on trade routes, planetary disasters that required evacuation, even a few systems reporting strange signals that might indicate new Ravager activity. "Jake," he said, "send a message to Earth Defense Command. Tell them we're going to need more ships." "Sir, what should I tell them about our mission parameters?" Admiral Stevens looked out at the stars, thinking about the responsibility that humanity had just inherited. They had proven that Earth's warriors could face the impossible and win. Now the galaxy was counting on them to do it again and again. "Tell them the galaxy has more people who need the kind of help only humanity can provide," he said, "and tell them we're just getting started." 6 months later, the Terran Intervention Fleet had become the most respected and feared military force in known space. Not because of their advanced technology, which remained primitive by galactic standards, but because of their willingness to fight for complete strangers.